Welcome to the Practical Futurist podcast, a bi-weekly show all about the near-term future with practical advice from a range of global experts to help you stay ahead of the curve. Every episode answers the question, what's the future of? With voices and opinions that need to be heard. Your host is international keynote speaker and practical futurist Andrew Grill.
Welcome to the first episode of Series 2 of the Practical Futurist podcast. We had such an amazing response to Series 1 that we're back again. As my first guest of the series, I'm delighted to welcome Nick Coleman, who is IBM's Global Head of Cybersecurity Risk, where he specialises in evaluating risk from cyber adversaries, digital transformation and regulation. Before joining IBM, he served as the UK government's National Reviewer of Security and authored the Coleman Report for the UK Parliament. Nick also holds an MBA with distinction and is a Fellow and Chair of Digital at the Institution of Engineering and Technology. He regularly advises boards around the world on digital leadership and how to manage the risks that result from traditional and emerging business models and how to create trust and resilience. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, the start of 2020, where are we in terms of cybersecurity and where are we going?
So I think it's a topic which gets into every discussion now, and I think that's partly because we're so digitally connected and dependent. I mean, all of our lives either are digital or actually enabled through digital, whether you're traveling, whether you're healthcare, whether your financial services, everything from government services and the like. And I think what we've seen is as we've risen the digital, we've also seen a number of risks evolve and the attacks evolve. So there's been a whole spate of attacks which have been financially motivated and there's a criminal industry which has grown out of it. So we've kind of grown to a world where cyber is now a risk that people are understanding. What we haven't quite got to is we haven't got a level of hygiene in some of our infrastructure to be able to repel some of those attacks. And there is some organizations which are still learning how to be ready to deal with these challenges, leaders and organizations.
So I know you do a lot with the World Economic Forum, and they've actually identified cybersecurity as one of the top risks throughout the world. And it's right up there with climate change, extreme weather and natural disasters. With the recent fires in my homeland of Australia, many are now saying we really are undergoing a climate emergency. So if the WF are picking up cyber alongside climate change as the top global risk, are we at the stage of declaring a cyber emergency, or are people just not listening to the warnings anymore?
It's a great question. And is it an emergency? I think if I look at the global risk report that the World Economic Forum pulled together of global leaders, so it was leaders talking about the impact to business and the risks which face them. And climate was one, and as you say, cyber risk was identified as another in the top 5. The challenge has grown. The impact is growing to organizations, and there are the volume of impact is also growing. So this is kind of a frequency, a higher probability, a higher impact level. So if you kind of look at the risk, well, what's the likelihood it's going to happen to me? Kind of high, and that's what you're seeing. And also, what's the likelihood it's going to be disruptive? And you're seeing all of those metrics are growing. I think if I remember one statistic from there's a great survey from the Ponemon Institute of the cost of a data breach of 2019, and it said the average time to identify and remediate a breach was now 279 days.
That's most of a year.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
And actually, as the days go up, the cost and the implications also go up to the organization. So is it that that we have a higher risk? Absolutely. A number of, the growth in terms of the complexity of the threat and the number of people who are doing it, the sophistication of attack, and the impacts that's causing all have gone up for sure. And the disruption as we grow our digital connections is also growing. And then if you kind of look at how well we've built some of the capabilities, it's not that people haven't built capabilities. It's just we have to get smarter. We have to get that 279 days and be more agile in our response and be quicker about actually recognizing things and being able to respond, so that when you start to see these patterns of attack, you as an organization can go, I think there's something which is happening there. A little bit like some of the other patterns you talk about, the other risks. You kind of, can we spot a pattern? Can we think, that's something which is happening. How do I immediately start to galvanize my defense and resources, minimize the impact, maximize our resilience?
Now, you're a practitioner in this space, so you are an expert. I dabble here because I'm a futurist, and in fact, the connection to disruption, I talk about disruption all the time. I think cyber is now another level of disruption. But I think the average person on the street really only a couple of years ago realised the impact when the ransomware, the WannaCry, disrupted organisations like NHS and WPP and Maersk, and even as we record, I think Travelex have got their website down. Do you think it's going to take more attacks like that for the consumer to say, we really worry about this and we want government to do something and have a step change in being aware that this is a risk to the economy?
So I think from a consumer perspective, we're going to think about resilience of services because, whether it's an IT failure or whether it's a cyber attack, the answer is if my service isn't running and I can't get access to the service, and can be a frustration, or actually can have more serious consequences if it's a requirement for a whole bunch of things. That might be financial, to pay the mortgage. It might be a hospital appointment, which then can have other impacts. So I think from a consumer point of view, we look at resilience, and we it's not a word I think consumers would use, but it's actually kind of, how do we maintain the trust of those people who we serve, both in the public and private sector, as citizens, consumers, that the services are resilient, that there is enough resiliency planning in there so that you can protect and you can respond. And again, kind of what's the impact that level of disruption, which is increasingly seen, and we're going to see more of it for sure, we can minimize that impact to the consumer, to the business, to the society at large, and that seems to be the question I think everybody should be asking. In the organizations I'm dealing with, how resilient are they planning? And and it's my and simple questions that they can ask those organizations.
So should executives and the board be cyber aware? Should there be more awareness at the board level, and should they go on courses so they understand the impacts? And therefore, when someone comes to them with a proposal for multi-million pounds to defend against an attack, they say, well, of course we're going to fund that. Where's education play a role in this?
It plays a huge role, and I think a personal passion of mine. So I'm a visiting professor at Lancaster University, and I've worked with a number of universities now about how we teach business school, both the current and both the execs and also the current crop coming through. How do we teach them to think about the digital risks of society? And I'm very clear that cyber risk is one of the digital risks, but there are in the world that everybody's emerging, then their world is underpinned by digital. And this is kind of, well, okay, so how do I know that I've understood the digital risk? I've asked the right questions. And then I'm ready to respond. So I think the education bit is both a literacy thing, and I've led a whole bunch of things in 2019 to rewrite some of the materials to make it business, not technical. So we'd start with the business and then we grow in the technology rather than the technology trying to grow in the business. And by that, we find a language which boards and leaders can understand because it's their language of risk and it's their language of resilience and how to run an organization. And so I think part of it is literacy. And then I think it's about capability. So it's both capability of control and both capability of organization to know they've got enough and an appropriate agile defense. And then the other big piece of education is about how ready for a crisis are they? And the studies show that the more you're prepared, the more, I think some of us think when you go on an aeroplane, if for those of us who go on airplanes and you hear the safety advice and, you go, oh, here it is again. And the studies show both in those kind of environments and also in cyber attacks that the more prepared you are, the better you are when it comes to an event that you can really handle. You have the processes, you have the experience, and you have this thing called muscle memory. And so so I think the education is both the literacy, it's about the controls and what kind of questions and due diligence we need to ask, and then it's about your role and preparedness and the capability you might need. How do you candidly speak to the media in the moment of a crisis? What do you say, knowing that also the adversary, the attacker, may be listening to you, and and if it's a live event, then you have to plan that. So there are some great ways to think that through, and I'm pleased to see the business schools are starting, and I'm really delighted. I've been passionate about it personally to start to get business schools to really teach it as a business subject and give them that skills in an exec format which works. And that's
so maybe we need to start doing cyber fire drills. I mean, most organisations have a fire drill every month or every quarter, and that muscle memory kicks in even if you haven't listened to it. Yeah, the exits are here. But I think it goes deeper because it's about technology, and it's about technology you can't see. So if there's a fire, you know where the fire is, you know not to go near it. But if there's a threat happening in your IT system and you can't see it and you're not a practitioner like you, maybe we need to do fire drills. Who has the key to the war room? Who has the access to the Twitter account? Who's got the emergency phone numbers? Are there things that people can be doing now to plan for that cyber fire drill?
Yes, so absolutely. I was involved last year in the launch of something called the IBM Mobile Cyber Command. And this is a 23 megaton lorry or truck in the vocabulary. And what it is, it's a vehicle which actually acts as a training center. And we have schools, we have executives who come through, and they train for exactly that scenario. And so it's a real live, it's got a data center in the truck, it's got the best comms, and you've got, video walls which show real-time things, from everything from stock tickers to show social media, to show actually some of the patterns of intelligence. And I think there's two bits. One is, first of all, organization and leaders have got to know what kind of patterns they can start to see. So it's not that you can't see an attack. You just need to have the artificial intelligence-enabled solutions increasingly, which can pull together patterns and show you what's happening from one part. Because some of the attacks are pretty, they tend to try and hide in the organization. So there might be little things happening, but actually pulling those together and seeing a picture is important. And so being able to recognize where you are and what's really happening is one thing, and then being able to actually understand how to prioritize. What do you do? What are the order? Who makes the decision about whether to unplug different systems and what the business impacts are? And these are kind of business-led questions. These are not IT questions. These are IT questions in terms of, it is a technology question, but ultimately it's a business decision about the risk. And so, so from what we've seen is a whole bunch of people come through and test two things. One is sort of their own capabilities, and also how they as a team work. The reality for most people is that they're not all going to be in the same room when those events happen. So how you communicate and how you deal with it and how you build those relationships and how you have plans which are able to deal with the fact that you might not have what you expect, the telephone directory, and some very simple things in that moment of crisis. So there's a role for education in getting leaders ready, doing the due diligence so the systems are absolutely resilient in line with the business appetite. Understanding a little bit also about the regulatory context, because that's also changed. And then this bit about actually being prepared for the crisis. I think are all really important bits.
You touched on a couple of things there, AI and regulation. I want to pick them apart. So it's clear that AI is going to have to be deployed here because the attacks are becoming more sophisticated. They happen very quickly. If AI can learn what's going on and then help the humans decide to decode that. But on the flip side, are not the criminals getting smarter, and aren't they starting to use AI to beat the AI of the defender? Are we in a sort of a yin and a yang that we learn and then they learn faster? Is this an AI war?
Well, I think so. Artificial intelligence, and there are a whole, and that we can talk about machine learning and a whole bunch of different elements to artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence for me is two sides of a coin. On one side, as we you see businesses and organizations roll out and enable things for artificial intelligence. I think my toothbrush is getting increasingly artificial intelligence embedded. And I make that as a sort of a light-hearted what it means for all of us is we're getting AI and machine learning in a whole set of devices, from things which sit on our kitchen tables to all the way to traffic lights and a whole bunch of things behind. And so we have a challenge that the digital world that we're evolving is increasingly AI enabled, and we have to think about how we move protection. And so I'm doing some work now with leaders around the world about thinking, and we spent about 6 months really in depth working out, how the future of the AI model has to be predicted. And then the second bit, which you touch on, is so in terms of AI, both as a defense and attack, how are we going to have that ability? And are the adversaries going to use AI? And I think the answer is absolutely.
They're probably doing it already.
And it's still evolving and, it's sophisticated. And there are some things about, we may get increasingly hyper-personalized attacks. So, AI will be used to learn how you and your email system and how you sign signatures, and we've already seen a bit of that, but it will start to learn how you communicate and all that kind of thing, and then will be much more tailored to you as an individual. So we might see more precision. On the other flip side, as you say, we'll be able to get to a world, and we already are, where we're employing some of the technologies to really see patterns. And also that's helping with protection as well. So where you're getting, for example, how to sign on to systems and your access, now you can use artificial intelligence to start to understand some of those patterns and who should be able, and whether what looks normal and what looks abnormal, rather than probably traditional, which is you just signed on. So kind of it's a having to protect the world, the digital world we're evolving, the AI world, and also then using cybersecurity, understanding the threat is going to be changing and using more AI, and how do you then use your defense to be agile across the different stages of security, from sort of identifying the risk all the way to protecting and defending it.
You brought up the toothbrush, and this brings us to the fact that everything's now becoming connected. IoT, Internet of Things, we've got Bluetooth-enabled toothbrushes, we've got Nest thermostats. I think we're going to start to see, so you talk about hyper-personalized attacks. If I want to attack the CEO or the CFO of a particular company, and I know where he or she lives, I'm then, I suppose, fighting the attack on a personal level at their home level. And if I know they've got some IoT devices, that brings a whole new things into it. So is the awareness not just at a corporate level about firewalls and gateways and email phishing campaigns and those sort of things, but also I think the last mile actually is down to the employee. If you compromise your own security by emailing passwords on Gmail, or you have unprotected IoT devices at home, should we not also be getting down to the employee level to say you are actually part of the solution if you're the weakest link in many ways?
I think employees, I think employees are just one group. I mean, citizens are a group, employees are a group, you get, you even get parents. I mean, like, I remember doing this thing with the European Union a couple of years ago, and they were saying, well, let's do the Security Awareness Month. And I said, well, the first thing we should define is, you have multiple roles as a person. And the reality is security should be embedded into all those roles. If you're a parent, then that might be about how, you work with your children, and how you work with the school to do that, and where you need to have biometrics and other techniques to be able to protect those environments. And similarly, in the home environment, yes, I think the takeaway is understand the role. Second, make the security appropriate for that environment. You have to manage it with the risk, and that's a cost thing, but also a pragmatic thing about how you run these environments. And the third thing is working out what the critical bits are and who owns them. So, if you take the employee scenario, what you're typically doing is you're maybe working from home. Well, that means that your responsibility is to make sure that you're protecting the corporation and the organization that you work for. And so yes, I think we can think about, those different roles. I think we should also understand that attackers tend to go for the easy thing sometimes.
Of course, yeah.
And so if, frankly, it's an easy thing to get people to click on links and people go, I've just won the lottery, let me click and see if I really have, then the attackers will continue to do it so while we worry about sort of the really targeted, sophisticated, which is also important, we also are our role is really to take it the hygiene as high as we can in the easiest way, to what I would describe as remove the noise. Just remove the noise, and then you can focus on the really bad stuff that might come really. And if you're doing the hygiene both at a personal level and also as a corporate, an organization, then it's easier for you to have the hygiene which removes some of that noise and then focus on the targeted, sophisticated, which still may be there in some specific examples.
I mean, it's got to be frictionless. I think of the whole notion of VPNs. Most people listening here would know what a virtual private network is. Some people use it to watch television in other countries that they shouldn't be able to. People like you and I probably use it to protect the tunnel that we're using back to the corporate mainframe. But if you have to actually flick a switch and do all this, there's friction then. I think people will go around that. So how can we make cybersecurity in the different roles that we play completely frictionless? Is it possible?
Well, I think it will never become totally frictionless, and there's some good things about having some friction, because actually it makes it a conscious decision. I think if you think about coming to a country and going through passport control, there's you put your thing on the reader. Could we do it in different ways? Yeah, but there's a process and the reason for doing some of those processes. And I think so. So it's not that it necessarily needs to be zero friction. I think it needs to be proportionate and usable. And I think the challenge is if you make it really difficult, then people find workarounds. So I think I look at some of the banking examples of the last couple of years, and how they've used biometrics to really be able to authenticate both voice biometrics and other biometrics with a whole load of other security mechanisms working. From the user perspective, some of it has become really simple.
I look at my phone and I'm on my banking app. Yeah.
Right. And so that's example of where we have to be agile in terms of the both solution, but also behind that we have to use multiple points to really understand it is still truly you. So is it your phone? Is it your location? Is it? And then I think the thing is that the friction can be spread across the transaction. So if you start to do something unusual in an organization, in your banking app or something, can we understand what abnormal looks like? And that might be for a whole bunch of reasons, cyber being one of them. But suddenly that's not usual, that doesn't look right, that maybe that outcome shouldn't be working like that. And really focus resources to kind of go, hang on, can we just verify that it is? Can we put an additional check in? And so we'll hopefully get to a world where the hygiene is good, the usability is kind of embedded, and proportionate in different stages. I think the final thing I'd say is the embedded thing. When you just talk about your phone and looking at it and being on, that's because it's been built in. And I think where we find a lot of friction is where it hasn't been built in. So where I think we'll end up with, and again, something I'm pretty passionate about, is engineering cybersecurity into build. So it's not something which is done later, which often costs more money, but is also part of that solution that you get in the car, in the bank, in the utility, that actually cyber is part of the process. And what that ultimately means is it's built for usability, but it's also built as part of the risk profile of building. And I think we've got into a world where we're testing a whole bunch of infrastructure to check for challenges and then remediating them, and we'll still need to do that. Where we see goodness is where that also goes further, and where the engineers themselves are starting to think about their digital transformations and how they engineer security in as part of the build process, checking code, checking all the things as they actually build systems that securely has been addressed in each of those stages.
We talked a while ago about being mobile first, maybe now it's cyber first, that when you do the code review, when you design the digital transformation process, you build it in. And it sounds like the sort of things that have to happen in the background can only be done at scale if you've got processing power and AI and everything else. And that means cost. I'm very fortunate in what I do. I generally talk to the C-suite of some of the largest organisations in the world, and I get a chance under NDA often to understand what they're spending their money on. And most companies, especially law firms, maybe it's remediation, are saying we just spent a truckload of money last year on cyber, in air quotes. They're probably not quite sure what they've spent it on, but someone has said they need it. Two reasons. One is I think they're now seeing there's a risk there and they've got to protect their risk, and their insurance company may have said your premiums go up unless we have a view of your cyber security strategy. But the second thing is regulation, and you mentioned this before, I just want to touch on that. Because being compliant with regulations such as GDPR have changed the cybersecurity landscape now. So risk management means you have to think about the regulatory compliance as well as security and controls and be agile and ready for the cloud model. Do you think the growth in cloud services has provided more of a threat than before? And what can be done to balance the convenience of cloud with end user security?
So just taking that apart, I mean, there's GDPR. There's also something called the NIS directive, which doesn't get as much publicity.
Not as sexy as GDPR.
So that's a specific piece of cybersecurity legislation. And what it did was it essentially identified for all the countries in Europe, including the UK, that we needed to focus on what critical infrastructure sectors and name critical infrastructure providers and make it clear that there were specific requirements.
So telco, water, power.
Yeah, so the financial services, exactly, etc. It also had a provision in there for cloud services at a lesser threshold and said, look, where there's cloud services, those will also now need to be regulated. And so yes, in addition to data protection, which also has, as you say, GDPR has security implications, there is cyber regulation as well, specifically now enacted and live in the environment, already passed and enacted, same kind of timescales as GDPR. I remember I was involved in some of these discussions when I helped launch the Latvian presidency in Riga, where we actually started to shape some of that legislation with them. So yes, it's a regulatory. If I come back to sort of what does that mean in practice, and what it, if you're an organization, be that one of those law firms or anything, and you're kind of having this, well, I'm spending it. It comes down to, well, I need to be able to demonstrate that I've got controls which meet the regulatory requirements and the risk portfolio that I'm running and are applied in context of my organization. And for sure, if you look at organizations, many of them have been building out frameworks. There's a framework from the National Institute of Standards and Technology called the Cybersecurity Framework, which has proved a backdrop for many, which has been great in terms of how to actually think about the problem. And it has 5 stages. And so there is identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover as a simple method of thinking about the challenge, and then a whole bunch of steps. And you can apply this and regulatory controls in terms of that, creating that framework and that landscape. And then I think the question is, well, so in this thing, how do I demonstrate that I've got adequate controls and I can show that I've done the due diligence and the proportionality? And this is about really then having an ability to translate that into, well, so this is the capability, this is how we've done it, and this is how we can evidence it through audit and assurance. And so very much sort of links to some of the things you talked about. Insurance have also got into this about, can you demonstrate it? Can we offset premiums and things like that? So absolutely regulatory's there. The thing I'd say, the other thing I'd say about regulation is you have both industry regulations, so you have banking regulations and you have other sectors regulating. And then you have these sort of horizontal data and cyber and other things. And, so the world is getting a little bit more complex in terms of, especially for organizations who do business internationally. We've had sort of, in California, we've had a Privacy Act just enabled 1st of January. So, for organizations who are working internationally, which for most of us is increasingly, right, then we have to think about how those controls can be agile to meet many needs. And so what some people have got stuck on is, well, let's have a program to do this piece of regulation. And then suddenly another one's come on. And then suddenly it's kind of, well, okay, do we need to do a delta for that? And the leading organizations I've been, speaking to have really started to understand that it's about capability. And then you can map it to different regulatory obligations in different jurisdictions. But ultimately you have a model which gives you flexibility, and you get a rule of, meeting a certain threshold. And then if there's a particular requirement or a particular operating environment which requires more, you can always increment, but you kind of come to a cost-effective baseline, which gives you things that enable you to get that hygiene going and monitor it. So it's been a catalyst for sure. The challenge is making it complexity, not a cost overhead, which is unbearable. You
mentioned complexity. This is an incredibly complex area which is changing all the time. So who is educating the regulators? They understand how their regulation needs to adapt and be agile for what's going on and the threats that are evolving? And is there a skills gap? And how do we address that in secondary school and university so that we've got more and more people that want to move into that and apply their knowledge and thinking and business prowess to stop these threats and protect us?
So a lot of this regulation, to deal with the first point, is relatively new. So part of this journey is to actually have that discussion evolving. And I think a number of the regulators have really been very open to understanding how the legislation is translating into operating environments and making sure that what their objectives are realistic. So I think it's a journey. I think that a number of them have to grow their own cyber skills, and that's a new thing. So you've seen a number of regulators try and build their skills. And I think there is still this area where, through some of the activities, these regulators are continuing to try and form ecosystems to be able to do that. Some of those have to be new because they've been used to it in traditional environments. So banking, for example, is more sophisticated. Some of the other regulated sectors, transport and others, have probably not had these discussions in that same way. And then we talk about skills gap and pipeline. I think, first of all, is we have to get better at getting role models. And so kind of podcasts like this for me are kind of a little bit of where we have to engage in new and different ways to make it understandable of what an exciting world this is. This is a digitally transformed world, and this is an exciting place to do it, and you can do amazing things in that career. And so for secondary education, there are a number of things. We see governments doing girls' competitions to get more girls in, literally in schools, and that's been hugely successful in different schools, in different competitions in different parts of the world, and truly brilliant. You've seen a number of initiatives from private sector. There's something called P-Tech, which was started in the US and is rolling out, which is about college and getting people interested in effectively vocational and industry engagement to really shape their careers in these things. And so I think it comes down to, can we excite people about the opportunity and make it interesting? And that for me is about wider than just cyber. That's about science, technology, engineering, maths, the STEM analogy. I remember I met Tim Peake from who was the astronaut who went to space. And I had the privilege of meeting him, I think, last year, and in that discussion, the reality was he was able to explain space, and yes, it's a physical concept. And that inspires so many people. And we have to do the same in cybersecurity. And so I think role models and doing that is important. And then I think literally, like, again, maybe a little bit like space, but a little bit broader, because I think we can get more audience and we've got more capacity. Then we think about how we can get people into those STEM subjects. And really thinking about how we also advertise that there are true opportunities to build and develop their careers. The final thing for me is a little bit about where the world is heading. And so I think as we talk on a podcast today, I say this again, digital enablement. This is about, if we think about our phones, they have apps, and we think about, and so getting the people in secondary school with the opportunity to figure out how to code with AI, how to actually start to use and experience this stuff, to me is also part of the challenge. So they don't just become consumers, but they actually become enabled digital citizens.
Yes.
And I see that in the Nordics, in other parts of the world, where they're really trying to get AI and all these topics into schools, but also practically touching people. And I know we're doing lots of it in lots of countries. To me, I think that's our next challenge.
Final question before I ask you about your 3 things for next week. We've talked about the response from governments, but what can you do if you're, say, a small charity, a multinational, or someone sitting at home listening to this podcast? What can they do?
So I think it's a great question. I think that there is a lot of advice out there, and I think the first thing is you should ideally have somebody in your network who is accredited by one of the professional bodies, and has some accreditations, who can be almost in the network as a trusted advisor and say kind of, okay, well, what does it mean for us and what are we? And then the second thing I think if you're a charity is you should have the conversation at the board, kind of as a trustees when you meet, kind of what does this mean to us?
We talk about risk, but have we talked about cyber risk?
Yeah, and almost kind of what does it mean to us? What is the critical data we hold? What is it? Do we hold stuff? So I talked to one charity who did stuff in medical, in youth health actually, and they understood that they hold sensitive records, and I was kind of saying, well, okay, so how does that relate to your infrastructure? And they said, well, that's our journey, and so we started just to have that simple question about, well, where's the risk? Who are the other advantage to some of this is in some of those organizations, that one I think had 5 employees. And so actually the challenges are easily addressable. And through adopting cloud and other solutions, they could really get best of breed. So this wasn't kind of a really cost expensive thing. It was a process thing. It was a practical thing. It was how we digest this and get the basics right. And kind of, and what they really wanted is they said, look, what we always look for is just practical advice. We want to spend cost effective and, we're a charity at the end of the day. But we also understand that we may have some critical assets, but at the same time, we may also have people who are looking at the weather on the internet. And, like all organizations, it has to be risk-based and actually let's protect what matters. Let's do the hygiene. And we should also probably be ready for a crisis just to know who one would call in the 5, how they would do it, and what the role of the key people be.
So, as this is the Practical Futurist podcast, I'm going to hold your feet to the fire. What 3 things can our listeners be doing this week to ensure they're protecting themselves from cyber attacks?
So I think the first thing they should do is think about their lives and think about what's critical, and have they thought about what matters and what's critical. The second thing is thinking about what good looks like. So what's acceptable as a risk level. So I think identify what, then think about the risk. And the third thing is if the bad thing happens, what would I do?
Who are you going to call?
Who are you going to call? Who are you going to worry? And who would you look to for, if you need to get, practical advice, where do you go? I think and I put this down to practicalities. If you're in a corporate organization, they should be aware of how those incidents, and not be afraid to say, like, something small might be happening which you may not think is a risk, but somebody else may want to. So just, positively report things which may look suspicious. That's what we hear all the time. The final thing on the sort of who would you call is think about it in your personal journeys. Think about it when you go abroad. You kind of in your mind think, hang on, what happens if I get sick while I'm traveling? Who am I going to call? Well, how am I going to get home? Who's going to give me the local doctor? And so for this, it's like identify what matters. Think about what the appropriate, if you've got a level of risk that actually you think is not quite right. Can you talk to other people if you're in an environment which can share that and understand whether they have a similar perspective? In work environments, that's really important. In business environments, in leadership, that's important. And then this bit about, well, what will I do? And can I make it practical? And do I have a backup if my phone actually doesn't switch on? How will I go through that experience?
Nick, thank you so much. How can people find out more about you and your work?
So I'm a bit on social media platforms like LinkedIn. People are welcome to reach out, and I'd be delighted. And then simply some of the other institutions I'm involved in, I'm available. And I think this is such an exciting world, and the more we can do to help everybody get to understand the risk is important.
Nick, I've learned so much today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Practical Futurist podcast. You can find all of our previous shows at futurist.london. And if you like what you've heard on the show, please consider subscribing via your favourite podcast app so you never miss an episode. You can find out more about Andrew and how he helps corporates navigate a disruptive digital world with keynote speeches and C-suite workshops at futurist.london. Until next time, this has been the Practical Futurist podcast.